So make sure that you're using the correct one. So I've got 3 different types of pens here. I've got kind of the Papermate Bic pens that are more marker-like. I've got the gel pens, and then I've got your ballpoint pen. So the difference is in the ink and the tips that you guys are using. So for this one, it kind of looks more like a marker. When you draw with it, it's very dark. It almost looks like a Sharpie, so you don't want to use this one. Then you've got your gel pens, which they have a very fine tip, but the gel, they tend to smear if you put your finger on it, so you don't want to use the gel pens either. This is the one that you want to use. You want to use your basic ballpoint pen. If you look into the gap, there's a ball at the bottom of your pen, and you're going to notice the way it just writes like a regular pen. Okay? So you want to make sure that you're using your ballpoint pen. The next thing that I'm going to go over is why I always have a napkin or a paper towel next to me. Because when you are constantly shading with your pen, it's going to start building up ink at the tip of your pen, and it's going to create like this really nasty gunk that builds up all the way on the tip of your pen. So instead of accidentally adding that gunk onto your paper, you wipe off your pen on the napkin and then you continue with your shading. You don't ever want to accidentally add that gunk onto your sheet of paper, because you're going to have a very noticeable darker spot on your paper if you don't clean your pen. So you always want to have your napkin available for you. It's also very helpful to, when you're drawing, to place your hand on your napkin so you don't smear any of the ink that's already underneath it with your hand, and that you're able to kind of draw on your sheet of paper without smearing it. Okay? So the next thing that I'm going to go over is the different techniques. So basically it's still the same thing: hatching, cross hatching and hatching, and then shading in the direction of the object. You want to make sure that even before you get started, you want to practice on a separate sheet of paper, on a sticky note, kind of get your hand warmed up a little bit before getting started on your actual final paper, because it takes like a few seconds or a few minutes of practice before actually getting the hang of it and then jumping onto your final paper. So I always like to have either a blank sheet of paper or a sticky note where I can start practicing my hatching. And with my hatching, I like to start doing like a value scale from dark to light. So for example, I'm going to do my hatching value. And with the pen, I'm going to start very lightly. Hatching is going parallel lines in the same direction. And very little pressure. So I'm going to start with my dark. I'm not necessarily putting a lot of pressure on my paper. I'm just building up the layers, as you can see. Just going back and forth. It's almost like you're coloring with your pen, but very lightly. Right? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be doing a lighter part. So I'm going to try and go from my darkest point and you want to start kind of fading it into slowly a lighter pigment. Okay, so this is hatching. Like I said, your strokes, basically what you're doing is I call it landing the plane and then taking off. So basically I'm putting my pen slowly landing the plane and then slowly taking off. Because if you write a plane and you just land and then do that, you just created like a giant dot at the bottom. So you want to make sure that when you land the plane, you are landing the plane and then taking off. You don't want to land and take off, because now you've, like I said, you've dented your paper. Okay, so it's a slight soft land, soft takeoff. And that's basically what I'm doing with every one of these strokes, is I'm landing the plane and slowly taking off. That takeoff is very important because it's what's going to get it to kind of fade out into a lighter pigment. And you get to kind of control your hand pressure a little bit more when you follow that particular land the plane and then take off. Okay? So that was the hatching value. Now we're going to move on to the cross hatching value. So we've kind of gone over these already last time with our practice. So cross hatching is basically going in different directions. So these are really good for larger areas or the areas that are going to be your darker point in your drawing, because cross hatching makes it so easy to layer and layer and build up the layers, but also to add that darker value and create a nice smooth transition from your darks to your lights and so forth. So same thing, I'm landing the plane and softly taking it off to create that value scale. And it doesn't matter how many directions you go in cross hatching. Just because it says cross does not mean that it's just going to be an X and those are the only directions that you can go to. If you notice, I went in a cross and then I went vertically. It just depends on how many layers you require to get the value that you want. I personally think cross hatching is the quickest way to get the value that you want. And it just kind of covers larger areas a lot quicker, okay? So you want to get some practicing in before you get started on your actual drawing. Like I said, we did some hatching value, which is vertical. We've done some cross hatching. Shading in the direction of the object is basically just hatching but in a curve. So I'm just going to show you a quick example of that in case you guys have curves. So let's say that I have this curve right here. Basically all you're doing is you're doing your hatching, starting your lines at that curve and really lifting that plane up to fade it out on the edge. Another way that you can do it is literally build up lines from the curve. This just takes a little bit more hand control because you're going to apply lighter pressure as you're fading out. And another way is obviously to do cross hatching from here. So I've gone in this direction and now maybe I want to go in the opposite direction and create a nice fade out as well. So just kind of depends what your personal preference is, but you definitely want to be mindful of when you're following the curve to really shade in that direction to make sure you get from your darkest point to your lightest point the way you wanted it to go. So as you can see, I ended up kind of doing like a mix of all of them to create that nice little fade out on your curve. Okay, so we've got some practice done. Now we're ready to move on to our final paper. So on our final paper, what I want you guys to do is to make sure that you guys are erasing your grid. So before shading, you gotta erase your grid. All you have to do is have the outline done. I personally like to do my outline in pen, very lightly sketch, that way I don't have to erase anything. If you use your pencil, you want to erase it to where it's like very light and you can kind of see it, but not really. That way you guys get, you can overlap it with your pen, no problem, okay? So erase the grid, erase some of the outline to where it's light enough to where you can still see it, but not to where your pen is going to, or not dark enough to where your pen won't cover it, okay? And then you're gonna just go for it. You're gonna decide what your method is and you're gonna start shading. So as you can see here, I've started building up my layer. It's a light layer, but I'm gonna show you how I got to that point. Once again, I have my napkin ready to kind of clean up my pen or just get it started. And we're gonna start. I love doing cross hatching. All of this has been done using cross hatching. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started with my cross hatching. Just like the last tutorial I showed you guys when we were doing our cartoon, I'm going to start by layering. And layering is key. That's the best way to get your pen drawing to be smooth and also to not rip through your paper. This is that landing the plane and taking off. You want to make sure that you're being very gentle. So this is how I got to this point. So now I know these two sections need to be probably as dark as this. So I'm going to keep building up that pigment. I'm going to do my cross hatching. So now I'm going to go in the opposite direction. And you can slowly start seeing how the layers start getting darker and darker. And even though it's a very slight transition, you want to be patient. This is where I say, like, pen drawings are super easy. You just got to be patient. If you're not patient, you won't get that smoothness that it almost looks like watercolor, okay? And you just keep going. So here, that little spot, I don't know if you guys can see it, but that little spot right there is gunk. I should have cleaned my pen or else that happens. So now I have to make sure everything around here is the same pigment as this spot because it just got so much darker with the gunk, okay? So that is the main reason why you want to have your napkin here, to make sure you're cleaning your pen. And you saw I haven't really drawn much with the pen. It builds up very quickly, so you want to make sure that you are cleaning your pen as often as possible to avoid that happening. I'm kind of glad it happened so you guys could see why I suggest having that napkin there to help you clean your pen. Okay, so for my style of shading, I really like to keep my lines very close together. I like them to be pretty tight to where it almost looks like I'm coloring, and leave a small amount of paper see-through because I want it to look smooth. I want it to look even. I don't want to have to put more pressure on one area than another because that's going to eat away at the tooth of my paper and it's not going to be taking the ink as well as I wanted. So that was what, maybe 3 layers. This is the 4th one, and you can see now I'm starting to get a little bit darker. Still applying the same amount of pressure I've been applying this whole time. The only difference is that, well, my layers are built, so now I get to make it a little bit darker by just adding more and more layers. Okay? So I want to say this is probably going to be the last layer I add here. And I know it's really hard to see, but when I'm applying pigment, I'm literally just picking my pen up and starting again, picking my pen up and starting again. When I go really fast, it almost looks like I'm going like a zigzag and applying pressure all the way, but no, I'm only picking up my pen and going back to where I started and going that way. So that's the movement that I'm making. I know it goes by very fast, so it almost looks like I'm actually going back and forth, but in reality, I'm starting right at the beginning and just doing lines again in the same direction to make it even. Because if you go in zigzag, sometimes you just overlap the same spot and now you have